Welcome to our deep dive into feeling good, the new mood therapy. Looks like you're really interested in how our thoughts can influence our feelings, especially when it comes to anxiety and depression. You've also flagged some practical techniques.
It's fascinating, right? How Dr. Burns breaks down these mental patterns, he calls them cognitive distortions, and shows how common they are.
Let's start with that term, cognitive distortion. What does that mean and how do they affect us?
Think of them as mental traps, shortcuts our brains take that lead to negative conclusions. They affect how we see the world and ourselves and can make us feel anxious or depressed even when the situation doesn't call for it.
You've highlighted some specific distortions in the book. Which one stands out to you as particularly insidious?
One that can be really damaging is all or nothing thinking. That tendency to see things in black and white. Like, if you didn't get the promotion, you're a complete failure, even if you've had other successes. It ignores the nuances and really impacts self-esteem.
I've definitely fallen into that trap before. It's like one setback eclipses all the good. Another one you've highlighted is overgeneralization. What's the danger with that one?
With overgeneralization, you take one negative experience and make it a sweeping rule about your life. Like, getting rejected for a date and concluding you're unlovable and destined to be alone forever. It's taking one data point and creating a whole narrative, which can be really limiting.
Okay, that's dramatic. I can see how these distortions can take a small situation and blow it out of proportion. It reminds me of mental filtering, which I'm also seeing in your notes.
Ah, yes. Mental filtering is like wearing sunglasses that only let in certain colors, except it's only the negative stuff getting through. You might have a great performance review at work, but fixate on that one area where your boss suggested improvement, completely overlooking all the positive feedback.
So guilty of that. It's like my brain is actively searching for the negative comment to ruin the whole experience. Speaking of dismissing the positive, there's another distortion related to that, right? Disqualifying the positive.
Exactly. It's almost the opposite of mental filtering. Here, you dismiss good things by finding reasons they don't count. Like getting a genuine compliment but telling yourself the person was just being nice.
Ugh, I do that with compliments all the time. It's like I can't even let myself enjoy positive feedback. So we've got all or nothing thinking, overgeneralization, mental filtering, and disqualifying the positive. It's amazing how many ways our brains can distort reality.
And we're just getting started. Jumping to conclusions is another common one, and it often involves mind reading and fortune telling.
So, like my brain has decided it's both a mind reader and a fortune teller, and not the optimistic kind. Tell me more about these.
With mind reading, you assume you know what others are thinking, and usually negatively. You might be at a party and just know everyone is judging you, even though there's no evidence. Fortune telling is predicting the future negatively, like convincing yourself you'll fail that presentation before you even start.
It's like self-sabotage almost. You're setting yourself up for failure before you even begin. I bet social media amplifies these distortions, doesn't it? It's a breeding ground for assumptions and negativity.
Absolutely. Social media can be a minefield for both mind reading and fortune telling. It presents a distorted view of reality, which can fuel these negative thought patterns.
Okay, this is getting a little too real for me.
Hmm.
I'm starting to see these distortions everywhere, and it's making me wonder, if our brains are so prone to these thinking traps, how do we even survive as a species?
It's important to remember that these cognitive distortions likely served a purpose evolutionarily. Back in the day, quickly assuming danger or focusing on potential threats could have helped our ancestors survive.
So it's like our brains are still running on that ancient operating system designed for a world full of saber-toothed tigers. But now we're dealing with traffic jams and work deadlines.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to become aware of these distortions. We need to train our brains to recognize when those old thought patterns are no longer serving us.
This is fascinating. I'm starting to see those cognitive distortions everywhere. What about our listeners? Are they noticing them too?
I'm sure they are, but don't worry, just remember, awareness is key. The more you practice noticing these distortions, the easier it will be to challenge them. But before we get into challenging them, let's dig into another distortion that you've highlighted, magnification and minimization.
Okay, what does that one entail?
It involves blowing negative events out of proportion while downplaying positive ones. Spilling coffee on your shirt becomes a major catastrophe, but landing a new client is just a minor win. It's almost like our brains have a negativity bias.
Oh, I am a master of that. It's like my brain has this zoom function that focuses on the negative and completely blurs out the positive.
Ah.
I'm also seeing emotional reasoning highlighted in your notes. That one feels particularly tricky to me because emotions can feel so, well, real and powerful. How does that distortion work?
That's a great observation. Emotional reasoning means letting your feelings dictate your thoughts. You feel anxious, so you assume something terrible must be about to happen. But feelings are not always facts. They don't always reflect reality.
This is a total light bulb moment for me. Can you give us a real-life example of how you've seen this play out?
Sure. I remember once, before giving a big presentation, I felt incredibly nervous. My heart was racing, palms were sweating, and I was completely convinced I was going to vomit.
So you were letting your anxiety dictate the narrative even though you had no real evidence to support that prediction?
Exactly. But here's the thing. The presentation actually went really well. I even got a promotion because of it. But in that moment, my anxiety had completely hijacked my thinking.
That's a powerful example of how our emotions can distort our perception of reality. It's like we need to learn to question our feelings, not just blindly accept them as truth. Have you ever found yourself doing that?
Absolutely. We all fall into these thinking traps from time to time. It's part of being human. The key is to become aware of them and learn how to challenge them.
So we've covered a lot of ground already, and it seems like we've only just scratched the surface. What other cognitive distortions do we need to be on the lookout for? Okay, let's keep going. What other cognitive distortions are out there?
Let's talk about should statements. These are those pronouncements we make, starting with should, must, or ought. And they can really pile on the pressure and lead to a lot of guilt and frustration.
Oh, I know those all too well. It's like this constant barrage of shoulds. I should be exercising more. I should be more organized. I should be a better cook. It's exhausting.
Right. It's as if we're setting ourselves up for failure with these rigid expectations. And instead of motivating us, these should statements often just make us feel inadequate and overwhelmed.
So how do we break free from this shoulding all over ourselves? Is it about cutting ourselves some slack?
I think it's about replacing those harsh shoulds with more flexible and compassionate language. For example, instead of I should be exercising more, you might say, I want to prioritize my health and I plan to incorporate more movement into my day when I can. It's about setting realistic goals and recognizing that progress, not perfection, is the key.
That's a great point. It's not about lowering our standards or giving up on our goals. It's about being kinder to ourselves in the process. So instead of beating ourselves up for not meeting some arbitrary standard, we can focus on making positive changes in a way that feels sustainable and empowering.
Exactly. Speaking of setting ourselves up for negativity, another distortion you've highlighted is labeling. It's like overgeneralization, but more focused on attaching negative labels to yourself or others based on isolated incidents.
I've definitely seen this one in action, both in myself and others. It's like instead of acknowledging a mistake, we label ourselves a failure or an idiot. It's brutal.
It is. And those labels can become self-fulfilling prophecies. They impact your self-esteem and influence your future behavior. Dr. Burns suggests challenging labels by, defining your terms and getting specific about what happened. So instead of saying, I'm a failure, you might say, I made a mistake on that project, but it doesn't define me as a person. It's about separating your actions from your inherent worth.
So it's about recognizing that we are not our mistakes.
Yeah.
We're complex human beings with strengths and weaknesses, and one mistake doesn't negate all the good we've done. That's a much more nuanced and forgiving way of looking at ourselves.
Precisely. And finally, we have personalization.
Okay, let's hear about personalization. What's that all about?
This is when you take responsibility for things that are outside of your control. Let's say your team at work misses a deadline. If you're personalizing, you might blame yourself for the whole team's performance, even though you only played a small part. It's like carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders.
Oh, I've definitely been there. It's that feeling of, if only I had done this differently, then everything would be okay. It could be so draining and unfair to ourselves.
Absolutely. It's a common pattern, especially for people who are naturally empathetic or have a strong sense of responsibility. But remember, you're not responsible for everything. This distortion often leads to so much unnecessary guilt and self-blame.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
10 cognitive distortions in total, all or nothing thinking, overgeneralization, mental filtering, disqualifying the positive, jumping to conclusions with its subtypes of mind reading and fortune telling, magnification and minimization, emotional reasoning, should statements, labeling, and personalization. It's kind of overwhelming to realize just how many ways our thinking can go awry.
It is, but here's the encouraging part. Just becoming aware of these distortions is a huge step forward. Once you can identify them, you can start to challenge them and develop more balanced and realistic thinking.
So instead of feeling helpless in the face of these negative thought patterns, we can actually start to take control. We can become like mental detectives, investigating our thoughts and exposing the distortions that are holding us back.
Exactly. And it's empowering to realize that we don't have to believe every thought that pops into our heads. We can question those thoughts, examine the evidence, and choose a more helpful perspective.
This is so insightful. Now that we understand what these distortions are, let's dive into the so what. How does understanding these distortions help us feel better?
It all comes down to that powerful connection between our thoughts and feelings. Remember, it's not external events themselves that make us feel a certain way, but rather is our interpretation of those events.
So if I'm feeling anxious about an upcoming presentation, it's not the presentation itself that's causing the anxiety, it's my thoughts about the presentation, the what if I mess up, the what if people don't like it kind of thoughts.
Exactly. And that's where the magic happens. Because if we can change our thoughts about a situation, we can change how we feel about it.
Whoa. Okay, you're blowing my mind here. This is powerful stuff, but I need to see it in action. Can you give us an example of how changing your thoughts led to a change in your feelings?
Sure. Not that long ago, I was feeling incredibly overwhelmed with work. I had taken on too many projects and was starting to feel burned out. My thoughts were spiraling into negativity. I was telling myself, I can't handle this. I'm going to fail. I'm not good enough. Classic catastrophizing and all or nothing thinking.
Sounds familiar. I think we've all been there at some point. So, how did you get out of that negative spiral?
Well, I remembered what I had learned about cognitive distortions. I started paying attention to my thoughts, noticing that I was engaging in some serious negativity, and once I recognized the distortions, I could challenge them. I reminded myself that feeling overwhelmed is normal, especially when you have a lot on your plate. I also reminded myself of times when I had successfully managed busy periods in the past.
So you were basically gathering evidence to counter those negative thoughts.
Yeah,
You were saying, hey, wait a minute, these thoughts aren't necessarily true. I've handled tough situations before, and I can do it again.
exactly. And you know what? As I shifted my thinking, my feelings started to shift too. I felt calmer, more confident, and more in control of the situation.
That's inspiring. It's like you took those negative thoughts hostage and flipped the script.
It reminds me of a time when I was feeling really anxious about giving a presentation. I was picturing myself stumbling over my words, forgetting everything, basically just completely embarrassing
It
myself.
sounds like you were engaging in some fortune telling, predicting a negative outcome without any real evidence to support it.
I was. But then I realized what I was doing and decided to challenge that thought. I reminded myself that I had prepared well for the presentation and that I actually enjoy public speaking. And almost immediately, the anxiety started to dissipate. It was replaced by excitement and confidence. And the presentation went really well. That's fantastic. It's a perfect example of how we can shift our emotional state by changing our thinking. It's like we have this incredible power within us to reframe our experiences and choose a more empowering perspective.
This is all making so much sense, but it also feels a little overwhelming. Like, how do we actually put this into practice? Dr. Burns talks about some techniques for dealing with these negative thoughts, right?
Absolutely. And that's what we'll dive into next. Dr. Burns offers a variety of techniques to help us challenge and change those negative thought patterns.
Okay, I'm ready to equip myself with some thought-busting tools. What are some of the techniques Dr. Burns suggests? Okay, I'm ready to equip myself with some thought-busting tools. What are some of the techniques Dr. Burns suggests?
Well, the first step is recognizing that you have some control here. Dr. Burns provides a toolbox full of techniques, and they all hinge on actively challenging and changing our thoughts. It's about becoming a thought detective.
Ooh, I like that, a thought detective. So how do we start our investigation?
The first step is identifying the distortion. Once you know what you're dealing with, you can apply the right technique.
Okay, so let's say I catch myself catastrophizing about an upcoming job interview. What's a good technique to use in that situation?
One powerful technique is examining the evidence. You put those negative thoughts on trial. What's the actual evidence that supports the idea that you'll completely fail the interview? Have you bombed every interview you've ever had? What are your strengths and accomplishments?
It's like cross-examining those negative thoughts, making them justify their existence. What other techniques can we use to expose these distortions?
The double standard technique is a great one. Ask yourself, would you be this harsh with a friend in the same situation? If your friend was nervous about an interview, would you tell them they were going to fail miserably? Probably not.
It's like we have a much higher standard for ourselves than we do for others. We need to extend that same compassion and understanding inward.
Exactly. And sometimes just noticing that double standard can help soften our self-criticism.
What about those negative predictions? Is there a way to test them out?
Dr. Burns calls it the experimental technique, where you design an experiment to test out your negative prediction in real life. Let's say you're convinced that if you ask someone out on a date, they'll definitely say no.
Ooh, that's a
So-
scary one. I've definitely avoided taking social risks because of that fear.
Right. With the experimental technique, you would actually go ahead and ask that person out. The outcome might surprise you. Even if they do say no, you've gathered valuable data, you've learned something about putting yourself out there.
That's such a great point. Even perceived failures can be reframed as learning experiences. What about that all or nothing thinking trap? What's the antidote for black and white thinking?
Thinking in shades of gray. That's the perfect tool for that. Let's say you're on a diet and you slip up and eat a piece of cake. All or nothing thinking would say, well, I've blown the entire diet.
Oh, the guilt spiral is real. I've definitely been there.
But thinking in shades of gray allows you to see that one piece of cake doesn't negate all the healthy choices you've made. It's about progress, not perfection.
That's a huge mindset shift. It's about giving yourself permission to be human and acknowledging that setbacks are a normal part of the journey. What about when our negative thoughts are just plain inaccurate?
That's where the survey method comes in handy. Let's say you believe that everyone finds you boring. Instead of accepting that thought as truth, conduct a little survey. Ask a few trusted friends or family members for their honest feedback. You might be surprised.
It's about challenging those distorted thoughts with real-world data. I'm noticing a theme here. It's all about putting those negative thoughts on the stand and making them prove their case.
Exactly. Another tool is the cost-benefit analysis. This one is particularly helpful when you're stuck ruminating on a negative thought. Ask yourself, what are the costs of holding on to this thought? Is it causing stress, anxiety, or sadness?
Sometimes we need to call out those negative thoughts for what they are. Energy drainers.
Right. Then, consider the benefits of letting go of the thought. Would you feel lighter, happier, or more at peace? This cost-benefit analysis can help you make a conscious choice to shift your thinking.
It's like we're giving ourselves permission to choose thoughts that serve us rather than thoughts that hold us back.
Exactly. You have more power over your thoughts than you might realize.
This deep dive into feeling good has been incredible. I feel equipped with so much more understanding of how my thoughts influence my emotions. What resonated most with you?
What's remarkable about Dr. Burns' work is how it empowers us to take control of our mental health. He provides practical tools that anyone can use.
And for our listeners who are digging into feeling good, we challenge you to pick one cognitive distortion you'll try to catch yourself using this week. Maybe you'll try that double standard technique next time that inner critic starts piping up.
Remember, these techniques take practice. It's like building a mental muscle.
So true. Keep that Dr. Burns book handy. And remember, you have more power over your thoughts and feelings than you might think. Until next time, keep diving deep.